I don't think a lot about playing cards because I was never really into card games. After I moved past Go Fish and War in elementary school, there was a pretty big gap before I made friends with whom I would play the occasional $5 a pot game of Texas Hold'em that I inevitably lost at least half an hour before the next person, and also my family's developed tradition of playing hearts anytime we were on vacation. And I like both of those games quite a bit, and I'm sure I would like others if they had been introduced to me. Card games are a good way to pass the time with the group, or even yourself if the existence of solitaire is to be believed. But the part of many card games that worries me most is always the start of a new round, and specifically the shuffle that I know will eventually be forced upon me. Because each time it happens, I am faced with a dilemma. I can't do a bridge. Now, I have in my life done one, even a couple as I've been practicing more over the past week, but it's like a 5% hit rate at best, and I think I'm a less cool person for that. It means I have to decide when the shuffle comes if I want to try to do the thing I know I can't do and look silly, or just not bother. So I shuffle any number of ways. This sort of grab and place thing works well enough, and honestly, for someone whose hands tend to fidget around, it's actually kind of pleasant for me to just do. There's something wonderfully tactile about playing cards that I've honestly never really noticed until this past week. And so, in honor of the subject of this video, what inspired all of the thought I've been putting into these 52 cards, I am going to spend the rest of it trying to pull off a bridge. We'll see how I do. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week Air Review. You can call me a person who doesn't understand metaphors, and today I am talking about DelGaudio's book, A Moral Man. If you watch my 55-minute discussion of DelGaudio's absolutely incredible in and of itself, you'll have heard me mention this book and my interest in it. It is, in effect, the man's follow-up to that show and a commitment to his multi-hyphenate status. I wanted to know what the book was, for one thing, and then see where it slotted into my understanding of DelGaudio and his work. And it turns out it slots real cleanly into in and of itself, effectively serving as an expansion on the more personal parts of that show. Stories 2 through 4 specifically, with the lion's share going to story 3, the deck of cards, and his time as a card mechanic hired to rig games of Texas Hold'em to make sure the right people walked away with the pot. It's not just that, of course. We learn more about his childhood and his mom, and how specifically her public pride and her sexuality impacted his social life. And it's all interesting, but I think it makes sense to emphasize the card mechanics stuff. Oh, hell yeah! Because we actually got very little of it in the show. We just got the idea as we watched him manipulate the cards while talking about the idea of deception through them. Secrets that people can't see because they don't even know that there's something to look for. Deception and secrets more broadly are at the core of A Moral Man, a book whose subtitle reads A True Story and Other Lies. And much of this deception is filtered through a classic philosophical text of the Western canon that is really just a less fun version of The Matrix, Plato's allegory of the cave. For those who don't know, it depicts a man's sudden realization that his whole world is not real, that he and everyone else around him are shackled, legs down and face forward towards a cave wall, and that the only things they see are a series of shadows cast by unseen puppeteers in firelight. This man leaves and sees the bright, beautiful world as it truly is, but when he goes back to tell the others what he has seen, he is attacked by those content with the darkness. It's one of those ideas that will likely be relevant through the entirety of intelligent existence, though it is interesting how the idea, which would now be called red pilling, has been co-opted by people who actually enjoy being taken into a shadow of a shadow, and they want to be celebrated for that ignorance. How DelGaudio reacted to the allegory when he first heard it says a lot about him and also explains a lot about the work he would end up doing. He wanted to know more about the puppeteers, being drawn to the deception itself rather than the deceived. He wanted to know about the architect of the Matrix. And I am sure whomever it would be at least as unpleasant to listen to monologue. Though really the idea doesn't even make sense in 2021. Back in the BCE times, there would only have been a handful of people who could have even been the puppeteers. But in 2021, we know they exist and that they're all over the place. Hell, your experience right now is being shaped by shadows shown to you by YouTube's algorithm. The sheer mass of puppeteers affecting us every minute of every day is exhausting. Though we all know what's at the top of it all. Capitalism, baby. Close. Were I more critically capable, I would likely have understood that DelGaudio was hinting at all of this in his initial bit of conjuring during In and of Itself. But I didn't have to do any legwork in A Moral Man. Yes. The reason I know that he's interested in the puppeteers is because he tells us point blank. The cave and those shadows come up time and time again in this book because ultimately it's about him coming to understand where his place in the cave really is. And while it does get a bit abstract in its depictions towards the end, there's not a lot of subtlety here. Nope. And that's perhaps the most fundamental difference between the storytelling done by DelGaudio across the art forms. In and of Itself is complex, layered, and personal to the audience. Everyone's gonna take something a little different away from it. Nope. A Moral Man isn't. It's blunt in what it's telling us and how. So I think more or less everyone will get the same thing from it. There's not a lot of room for interpretation because there is virtually nothing to interpret. Close. Even the question posed by its subtitle ultimately isn't that important. I talked extensively in the last video about the concept of lying to tell the truth and how I've done it in my own work, but before I decided to make that part of the script personal, I talked theoretically about a method that DelGaudio admits to doing in this book, taking another person's story and presenting it as his own. I had kind of assumed that there was some of that in and of Itself, especially in the Wolf story, and indeed the timeline presented by A Moral Man doesn't fully square with what we heard on stage. But even if those stories weren't his, it makes sense for him to tell those as though they were. This is something I've thought about before when writing my own scripts like these or bits of weird performance art. What is the cost of the actual truth in that moment? If I say something happened to a friend, even if I witnessed it, it makes the story seem less credible by virtue of being a second-hand account. And we lose something in that. Because all of us have been conditioned to be leery about stories that don't come directly from the source, especially when they sound too good to be true. In and of Itself was centered around a story about a story about a story about a story about a man. And in the tellings and retellings, something that may have actually happened becomes far grander and definitely apocryphal. But what if Derek DelGaudio had actually been the relatista, telling us that he had put a real loaded gun to his head instead of a metaphorical one? In the context of that show, with his confessional type of onstage storytelling, the fantasy would become something very, very different. In the case of A Moral Man, DelGaudio wants us to understand the experience of being a card mechanic so that when the weight of what he's done comes crashing down onto him, we feel it too. And though his story as Cody the Wolf is hardly uninteresting, it also doesn't have a lot of the drama that it would had he done it for longer and in more places. But even a single round in a card game where he is fixing the shuffle would likely be more stressful than anything I've done in my entire life. And to get us a little closer to understanding that on the page, he lies to tell the truth. Plus, it's probably for the best that there's ambiguity, because one of the questions that I keep coming back to was, did I need these gaps filled in? I know a lot more about Derek DelGaudio than I did before reading this book, and most of it is very interesting. He is a solid writer, and the 235 pages flew on by. And while I can't pretend like I didn't miss his presence and delivery, the prose bare minimum did its job in keeping me going. And yet I wondered if I needed to know it. At the end of In and of Itself, DelGaudio would go off stage and not come back. Sometimes people would ask to talk to him, but most people didn't because they just did not want the magic of the moment broken. And though it would be a step too far to say I was disappointed by A Moral Man because it does shatter some of those illusions by clarifying things I didn't know that I didn't need or want clarified, I do feel more conflicted about it than I had expected. 7.5 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hammer and Marco, Kat Suricata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, Magnolia Denton, Elliot Fowler, Greg Lucina, Liam Knipe, Kojo, Phil Bates, Willow, and I Am the Sword. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I do not care. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you in the next one.